In the summer of 1944, as Allied forces prepared their invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, Adolf Hitler remained certain of one thing. The real invasion would come at Calais. He believed this with absolute conviction. Every briefing, every intelligence report, every Luftwaffe reconnaissance flight, every intercepted Allied message, all pointed to the same conclusion. Hitler was convinced. The German High Command was convinced. Even Allied bombings seemed designed to pave the way for a landing at Calais. There was only one problem. It wasn't true. The Allies were preparing to land in Normandy, and the only reason Hitler failed to see it was because of a man he had never heard of. Brigadier Dudley Clarke, the British officer who built entire armies out of thin air. Clarke was not a general in command of soldiers. He commanded something far more elusive: ideas, illusions, false movements, fake units, and stories so believable that the German High Command trusted them more than reality. He invented armies that did not exist. He moved divisions that were never there. He positioned armored units made of plywood and canvas. He created radio networks with no soldiers behind them. He spread rumors so convincingly that German agents reported them as fact. And Hitler, a man obsessed with his own intuition, believed every word. This is the story of how one man, using deception, imagination, and a deep understanding of how humans make decisions, altered the course of World War II without firing a single shot. The beginning of a shadow war. Dudley Clarke was not a typical British officer. While others studied artillery tables and infantry formations, Clarke studied psychology, misinformation, rumor networks, fear, human behavior under pressure, how armies interpret intelligence, how leaders think, and how to manipulate perception. He understood early in the war that World War II would not be won by strength alone. The Axis had millions of soldiers, armored divisions, air fleets, a vast industrial machine, powerful propaganda, early battlefield victories. But Clarke saw an opportunity they overlooked: deception as a strategic weapon. This was not new. Military deception had existed for millennia, but Clarke elevated it to an art form. He built a deception organization in Cairo that operated like an intelligence laboratory. Designers built fake tanks. Carpenters constructed dummy artillery. Radio operators simulated entire divisions. Artists created false unit patches. Officers acted as decoys. Rumors were planted in diplomatic circles. Misleading maps were accidentally leaked. Movements were staged to trick spies. This organization would later become known as a force, the unit responsible for the most sophisticated deception operations of the entire war. The man behind the legend. Clarke was a quiet man with a calm voice and an imagination that never stopped turning. He was not physically imposing. He did not seek the spotlight. He worked in rooms filled with cigarette smoke, papers spread across tables, and maps marked with red strings and pins. He thought like an enemy commander. He tried to see the world through German eyes. What they feared, what they expected, what they believed was logical. He once wrote in a private note, "To trick the enemy, you must first know what he already believes." Clarke did not invent lies. He invented the version of truth the enemy wanted to believe. And the German High Command wanted to believe that the Allies were predictable. Clarke turned that belief into a weapon. The first experiment: deceiving Rommel in North Africa. Clarke's first major test came in North Africa. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was terrorizing British forces. He outmaneuvered them, outthought them, and repeatedly crushed their offensives. Clarke realized that if he could not stop Rommel with tanks, he would stop him with shadows. He created imaginary brigades and fed their movements into channels he knew German intelligence monitored. He used dummy radio traffic, misleading troop movements, fake concentration of vehicles, staged construction activity, and double agents. Rommel began shifting reserves to counter threats that did not exist. A German officer wrote later, "Our intelligence constantly reported new British units. They were everywhere and nowhere." Clarke's illusions bought time and repeatedly blunted Rommel's plans. But this was only the beginning. From shadows to armies, the birth of the Ghost Army. By 1943, Clarke's methods had grown beyond small deceptions. He now worked with the British, the Americans, the Canadians, and all Allied intelligence branches. Together, they built something unprecedented: entire armies made of deception. These phantom formations included corps headquarters, armored divisions, infantry brigades, airborne units, supply depots, field hospitals, radio battalions, motor pools, airfields. Every one of them was fictitious, but to the Germans, they were real. Radio operators simulated command nets so convincingly that German intercept officers plotted the movements of non-existent divisions on their maps. Artists painted insignia for units that never had soldiers. Civilians near ports were paid to casually mention the wrong troop embarkation numbers in bars and cafes. Even laundry deliveries were faked. German intelligence counted uniforms sent out for washing as a measure of troop presence. Clarke made sure the numbers were wrong. Everything the Germans saw confirmed their worst fears. They believed the Allies had far more forces than they actually possessed, and Clarke had not yet played his trump card. Seit the creation of the biggest fake army in history. In 1944, as the Allies prepared to invade Europe, Clarke was given his greatest assignment: convince Hitler that the invasion would come at Calais and not at Normandy. To do this, Clarke and his American partners created the first United States Army group, known as FUSAG. It was commanded on paper by General George S. Patton. This choice alone was genius. Patton was the general Hitler respected most and feared most. Where Patton went, Hitler believed the attack would follow. So Clarke placed Patton at the head of a force that did not exist. FUSAG's location? Pas de Calais, the place Hitler already expected the invasion. What followed became the greatest deception operation in military history. The weaponization of belief. Clarke understood something powerful. People tend to believe what they are already convinced is true. Hitler believed Calais would be the invasion site because it was the shortest distance to Britain. He ignored Allied convoy movements, ambiguous radio signals, changes in weather, reconnaissance inconsistencies, resistance intelligence, and common sense. Clarke did not need to invent new lies. He only needed to add weight to Hitler's existing beliefs. He did this with fake camps, dummy tanks, inflatable artillery, wooden airplanes, falsified training schedules, pointless officer meetings, misleading supply routes, choreographed activity, fake airfields, and thousands of radio messages sent by operators with no troops behind them. German reconnaissance aircraft flying over southeast England confirmed everything. An army was gathering. A giant army. Patton's army. It was all fake. But Germany believed it. Hitler was so convinced that even after the Allies landed at Normandy, he held the 15th Army at Calais for months, waiting for an attack that would never come. The man responsible? Dudley Clarke. The quiet officer who built an army out of illusions and fooled Hitler into weakening Normandy at the moment of invasion. The birth of a shadow invasion. By late 1943, the Allied High Command knew that the invasion of Europe Operation Overlord would succeed or fail based on one factor: where the Germans believed the invasion would land. If the German High Command guessed correctly, the Allies risked disaster. If they guessed incorrectly, the door to Europe would open. For Dudley Clarke, this was the opportunity he had been preparing for since the earliest days of the war. He was brought into the planning for what would become the largest deception operation ever conducted. Operation Fortitude, part of the broader Operation Bodyguard, the deception plan for D-Day. This was Clarke's masterpiece. The use of phantoms, illusions, and psychological traps to shape German expectations. But to mislead Hitler, Clarke needed to deceive not just generals, but entire intelligence networks. The objective: fix the German 15th Army in Calais. The German 15th Army was the strongest defensive force along the western coast of Europe. It guarded the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. Its units included elite infantry divisions, armored regiments, heavy artillery, anti-tank positions, coastal guns, airfields, reinforced bunkers. If these forces rushed to Normandy on the first day of the invasion, the landings might be pushed back into the sea. The Allies needed the 15th Army to stay right where it was. Clarke's job was to make Hitler believe that Calais was the real target, not for a day, not for a week, but for months. The deception needed to be believable, consistent, reinforced by multiple channels, impossible to ignore, aligned with German expectations. Clarke knew exactly what to do. Thus is the creation of Fusag, the most dangerous army that never existed. Clarke understood that the Germans feared General George S. Patton more than any other Allied commander. To the German mind, Patton was aggressive, unpredictable, fearless, relentless. The ideal invading general, Clarke proposed placing Patton in command of the 1st United States Army Group, Fusag, a completely fictitious army. Fusag existed only on paper and in radio waves, but Clarke's illusions made it look real. He surrounded Patton with fake corps, dummy armored divisions, non-existent infantry brigades, imaginary airborne units. These phantom units were given fabricated insignia, invented histories, fictional training exercises, detailed organizational charts, officers who existed only in reports. To German intelligence, Fusag was massive. In reality, not a single soldier belonged to it. How Fusag appeared to German spies. Clarke transformed southeastern England into a stage set for a phantom army. He placed inflatable Sherman tanks, wooden trucks, plywood aircraft, fake artillery, dummy supply depots, imitation fuel tanks, fake landing craft. Every piece was positioned where German reconnaissance planes were most likely to fly. But Clarke did not rely on models alone. He used sound. Loudspeakers broadcast the noises of tank engines, construction, and artillery drills. He used movement. Convoys of empty trucks drove in circles to simulate supply operations. He used radio waves. Entire networks of radio operators simulated battalion and regimental communications for units that did not exist. He used human behavior. Fake officers visited towns, drank in pubs, and casually spoke of upcoming operations. German agents, many of whom were double agents working for the Allies, reported every detail back to Berlin. Everything confirmed the same narrative. Patton is building a massive force for an invasion at Calais. Clarke had turned improvisation into strategy. Double agents, Clarke's hidden weapon. The British controlled nearly every German agent in the United Kingdom through the double-cross system. This gave Clarke a direct pipeline into the mind of the German High Command. He used Agent Garbo, Juan Pujol, the most successful double agent in history. He provided meticulously crafted reports that reinforced the Calais deception. Agent Tate, a Norwegian double agent who fed German handlers movements of phantom units and false embarkation numbers. Agent Bronx sent fabricated documents showing massive preparations for a Calais landing. These agents were treated by German intelligence as completely reliable. Their reports became the backbone of Hitler's belief that Calais was the true objective. Clarke's brilliance was in subtlety. He never made the deception obvious. He let the Germans discover what he wanted them to believe. The key to deception: make the enemy deceive himself. Clarke understood that deception works best when it aligns with what the enemy expects. Hitler wanted to believe the invasion would come at Calais because it was the shortest crossing. It was closest to German territory. It had the best port access. Allied bombers targeted the region. Prior invasions tended toward shorter routes. Many Allied feints had pointed in that direction. So Clarke fed him exactly that. He once wrote, "The most successful deception uses the enemy's own logic against him." This principle guided every aspect of fortitude. Clarke did not try to convince Hitler of something absurd. He simply added weight to a conclusion Hitler had already reached. The deception was not built on lies. It was built on bias. Say, the German response. Fortitude works perfectly. As spring 1944 approached, German intelligence became increasingly confident that the Calais region was the target. They intercepted fake radio messages, movement orders, weather reports, training schedules, supply manifests, airfield expansion plans, logistical maps, all pointing to Calais. German analysts confirmed that. An enormous army was gathering. Patton was in command. Landing craft were positioned nearby. New airfields supported the buildup. Armored divisions were preparing for deployment. This intelligence was not questioned. It fit perfectly into German expectations. Clarke had achieved the impossible. He made the enemy trust British and American lies more than their own eyes. Even after Normandy landings began, movement of Fusag's fake radio traffic convinced Berlin that Patton still planned to attack Calais. Hitler delayed moving the 15th Army. Then he delayed again. Then again. And by the time he realized Normandy was the real invasion, it was too late. Clarke's illusions had saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. D-Day arrives, but the deception continues. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history, landed on the beaches of Normandy. But for Dudley Clarke, this was not the climax of his work. It was only the middle. The success of the landings depended not just on getting ashore, but on surviving the days that followed. The first 24 hours would decide the fate of the entire operation. If the Germans understood quickly that Normandy was the main invasion, they could rush elite units from Calais, Belgium, and the Pas-de-Calais region to crush the beachhead. If they believed the invasion was a diversion to distract from a real landing at Calais, they would stay put. Clarke's task now was to ensure that even as Allied soldiers were dying on the beaches of Omaha and Utah, Hitler would still be staring at Calais. The illusion had to outlive the reality. The first hours. German generals are divided. By midday on June 6th, German commanders began receiving reports from Normandy. Heavy fighting, unexpected landings, paratroopers, naval bombardments, armored units approaching field. Marshal von Rundstedt suggested that Normandy might be the main attack. General Jodl hesitated. Rommel, who was not in France that morning, sent urgent messages demanding reinforcements. But the German high command was fractured. Hitler was asleep, his staff unwilling to wake him. When he finally received the reports, his instinct told him one thing: Normandy was a trap. The real invasion was still coming, and Clarke had given him the evidence he needed to believe that. Fortitude South continues. Fusag prepares to strike. While Allied troops fought for their lives on the beaches, Clarke's Phantom Army was busy preparing for a Calais invasion. Radio operators sent out false embarkation orders, fake weather concerns, counterfeit briefing summaries, coded movement commands, status reports from imaginary officers. Inflatable tanks were repositioned to simulate armored formations readying for departure. Fake landing craft were arranged in visible ports along the Thames. All of this was done while the real invasion was unfolding hundreds of miles away. To the Germans, this created a simple picture. Normandy is a diversion. Calais is the target. Hitler accepted this explanation instantly. It matched his worldview, his assumptions, and his strategic preferences. Clarke could not have asked for more. Motsain. German reconnaissance confirms the lie. The Luftwaffe weak and stretched thin-launched, limited reconnaissance flights over southeastern England. What they saw was exactly what Clarke wanted them to see. Armored vehicles under camouflage nets, supply depots growing, airfields bustling, new tracks from heavy vehicles, ships in harbors, troop concentrations near Dover, radio chatter everywhere. Of course, almost none of it was real. But the Luftwaffe photographed it anyway and delivered the images to German intelligence officers. The officers were stunned. Everything confirmed their expectation of a Calais invasion. One intelligence report stated, "A major American force under General Patton is preparing to cross the Channel. The Normandy landings are tactical and not strategic in scale." The deception was working perfectly. Japanese intelligence falls for it too. Tokyo received German reports claiming that the Normandy landings were diversionary. Japanese analysts, reviewing double-crossed intelligence, concluded the same. This led to one of the most extraordinary messages ever intercepted during the war. The real invasion will be between Calais and Dunkirk. The landings in Normandy are a feint. This message was later used as evidence that Clarke's deception had influenced not just Germany, but its allies. When multiple nations agree on the same false conclusion, the lie becomes stronger. July 1944. Germany still believes the attack is coming. Weeks passed. The Allies were fighting inland, breaking through hedgerows, expanding the front. Still, Hitler refused to release the 15th Army. Over 19 divisions stayed locked in place around Calais. Clarke's deception had frozen a massive portion of German combat power. These divisions included armored units, elite infantry, heavy artillery, mechanized brigades, reserve formations, units that could have been decisive if moved south. Instead, they waited for an invasion that would never arrive. Clarke had achieved what no general could. He neutralized an entire German army without fighting it. August 1944. The trap remains closed. Even after Allied forces broke out of Normandy during Operation Cobra, the Germans still held fast. Hitler believed the Normandy breakout was a trick. Patton's army was still preparing to invade. The main landing would follow the breakout. The Pas de Calais must be defended at all costs. Clarke's deception had become stronger than reality. Even as Allied armies swept across France, even as German forces retreated, Hitler's strategic focus remained locked on a threat that did not exist. German generals start to question it, but too late. By early August, some German commanders began voicing doubts. Why hasn't Patton attacked? Why has the Calais invasion force not moved in 2 months? Why haven't we detected naval buildup in the Dover Straits? One intelligence officer sent a dangerously blunt message. There is no sign of a second invasion. We may have been deceived. He was ignored. By this point, the deception had grown so large that admitting it felt more dangerous than believing it. It is difficult to reverse your own dogma in the middle of a war. Clarke understood this deeply. He built his strategy on it. And now the Germans were trapped inside their own assumptions. The cost of belief. How many lives did the deception save? Historians estimate that the fortitude deception kept more than 250,000 German troops away from Normandy for nearly 2 months. Those divisions included armored reserve, mechanized infantry, elite SS units, heavy artillery regiments, mobile anti-tank brigades. If even half of these units had moved south in June or July, the Allies could have been pushed back, isolated or encircled. Instead, they advanced. Behind every mile gained was the shadow of a deception the Germans still believed. Now, the man at the center of the web. Throughout this process, Dudley Clarke remained in the background. He wrote reports, coordinated agents, reviewed intelligence, and refined the illusion. He avoided publicity. He ignored credit. He slipped between meetings like a ghost. Clarke did not command tanks or ships. He commanded perception. He never saw the beaches of Normandy, but without him, the landings might have failed. As one historian wrote, Clarke fought a war of the mind, and in that war, he was undefeated. The deception does not die when the enemy learns the truth. By late August 1944, the German 15th Army finally began to realize the invasion at Calais was not coming. The truth arrived slowly, reluctantly, painfully. Officers reviewed reconnaissance photos. No buildup, no movement, no shipping, no pattern. But even as reality emerged, Clarke's deception continued to shape events. German commanders debated. Was the invasion canceled? Was the Normandy breakout meant to draw them away? Was Patton planning a landing after the breakout? Should they still hold Calais? Even in uncertainty, the 15th Army remained paralyzed. Every hour they hesitated was an hour the Allies used to break across France. Clarke had discovered something profound. A successful deception lasts longer than the lie itself. The Germans were trapped not by false armies, but by their own fear of making the wrong decision. The Patton takes the field. The irony of history. The greatest irony of the entire deception was this. Once Clarke's fake army achieved its purpose, the real George Patton arrived in France and began doing exactly what the Germans feared. Patton's Third Army broke out of Normandy, drove across Brittany, swept through central France, and became the fastest-moving army in history. German commanders were stunned. For months, they had been preparing for Patton, the Phantom Patton commanding Phantom armies. Now, the real Patton had arrived, and he moved faster and struck harder than any general they had ever faced. One German officer wrote later, "The Americans deceived us twice. First, with a fake Patton, then with the real one." Clarke could not have scripted it better. The destruction of German reserves, the final consequence of fortitude. The German 15th Army finally began redeploying southward in mid-August, but by then, the Allies had broken through. Paris was about to be liberated. Supply lines were collapsing. Fuel shortages were catastrophic. The Wehrmacht was losing the ability to maneuver. Allied air power dominated the skies. The 15th Army never arrived in time. When they finally reached the front, they were thrown into battle piecemeal, arriving in fragments, disorganized, without the ability to coordinate. The chance to crush the Normandy beachhead had passed forever, all because Dudley Clarke had convinced Hitler that the real invasion was always 1 week away, 1 day away, 1 hour away. The Germans kept waiting for a blow that would never fall. That wait cost them France, and it cost them the war. The cost of the deception, the price paid in shadows. Clarke's operations saved the lives of tens of thousands of Allied soldiers, but they also carried costs few historians mention. Double agents lived dangerous lives, never certain whether the Germans would discover their loyalties. Entire Allied units trained in strict secrecy to avoid revealing movements that might undermine the deception. Civilians across Britain were bound by secrecy regarding troop movements that, in reality, didn't exist. And worst of all, German counterintelligence officers who saw inconsistencies and questioned the deception were often ignored or punished for speaking against Hitler's assumptions. The deception did not kill them, but it contributed to the collapse of German military logic. The tragedy of soldiers fighting in confusion is part of the cost of every deception in war. Clarke understood this. He saw war not as a contest of armies, but as a contest of choices, each shaping the fate of nations. After the war, Clarke disappears into history. After White, Dudley Clarke did not write memoirs. He did not seek fame. He did not appear on radio programs or give public speeches. He returned quietly to military work, served in staff positions, and lived in near anonymity. Even his fellow officers often did not know the scale of his achievements. Most of his work remained classified for decades. When the documents were finally released, historians realized this one man had influenced every major Allied deception of Wetui, North Africa, Italy, the Middle East, Normandy, Calais, and operations across the Mediterranean. He shaped the enemy's perceptions more than any general shaped the battlefield. As one intelligence officer wrote, Clarke fought war in a way no historian can properly measure, because the men he defeated never saw him. The legacy, deception, becomes a modern weapon. Clarke's ideas became the foundation for modern psychological operations and strategic deception. NATO planners adopted his principles. Cold War intelligence agencies studied his World War II operations to understand how to shape Soviet perceptions. Military academies teach fortitude and bodyguard as essential case studies in intelligence warfare. His legacy lives on in misinformation campaigns, counterintelligence operations, electronic deception, cyber warfare, modern disinformation, psychological operations, PSYOPs. Clarke did not just influence World War II, he changed warfare itself. The final word, the power of one mind. Dudley Clarke proved a truth that generals rarely acknowledge. A brilliant idea can defeat an army. He did not command divisions. He did not lead soldiers into battle. He did not fire a single shot. But he altered the decisions of an entire enemy nation. He made Hitler freeze his armies, ignore the real invasion, and waste his strength defending shadows. Clarke's victories were fought in meetings, in maps, in coded messages, in the minds of enemy analysts. In the end, his greatest weapon was not deception, it was understanding. Understanding how leaders think, how fear spreads, how armies interpret intelligence, how belief becomes stronger than fact. Dudley Clarke fought in a war of illusions and consequences. And in that war, he was undefeated.